I want to make something very clear. The illegal blockades seeking to take our neighborhoods and our economy hostage, and the collective COVID fatigue we are facing are two very separate things. If you joined the protests because you're tired of COVID, you now need to understand that you are breaking laws. The consequences are becoming more and more severe. You don't end up losing your license, end up with a criminal record, which will impact your job, your livelihood, even your ability to travel internationally, including to the US.
Your right to make a political statement does not outweigh the rights of 1 million people in Ottawa to live peacefully, free of harassment and chaos in their own homes. So let me be as clear as I can. There will be consequences for these actions, and they will be severe. We've already started by going after the money funding the illegal occupation.
In the last 24 hours, there's been sharp words and actions by federal and provincial leaders. Provincially, convoy donations have been frozen, a state of emergency declared, increased police powers and fines. And federally, the Prime Minister chatting with President Biden and warning that everything is on the table as the Truckers' Freedom Convoy enters its third week.
Now, to talk about the federal and provincial response is our political panel, CTV News political commentator Scott Reid and Tom Mulcair. Scott, of course, you were a former advisor to Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin. Tom, the former NDP leader, and also joining us tonight, Conservative strategist Jamie Ellerton. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to start with you, Scott Reid, on this one here. These remarks we heard from the Prime Minister today, should he have made these remarks a week ago? We have been chatting with our crime and safety analysts who have acknowledged that this is the 11th hour, and the 11th hour was, well, actually a week ago.
Yeah, I think so. I think he should have been saying these things emphatically, clearly, earlier, and regularly. I just think that, to me, the fundamental issue comes down to this. People watch what's happened in Ottawa and they say, well, where's the government? Where are our institutions? Are we just subject to mob rule, or is the rule of law still in force? And I think that the federal government and all governments should have been more present, more persistent, and it shouldn't have taken down, it shouldn't have required the shutdown of international trade to trigger such a robust multi-governmental response. We should have been hearing this constantly, persistently before this.
So, Scott, why do you think the Prime Minister did not make this move sooner? Why did the Premier not make this move sooner? Perhaps we could have, in some ways, avoided what took place in the last week at the Ambassador Bridge.
I think fear, if I want to be honest about it, I think, and to be honest, like, if I had been there, maybe I would have been cautioning the Prime Minister also, you know. Prime Minister, you're a lightning rod for these people. If you go out and make yourself too much a matter of the focus, it's just going to exacerbate the problem. Perhaps it was a concern that, well, you know, we're going to generate hostility, violence possibly, all of these things. But, you know, I keep coming back to it. From my perspective, when you're confronting something like this, which is fundamental lawlessness and incoherence, you have to be almost strident in saying, sorry, this is not how it works here. Your rights are limited by your right to not interfere with others. And so I think there should have been a louder, more vociferous, more persistent response far earlier.
Tom, I wanted to ask you, what's your take on the state of emergency that we're now in? Do you feel the Premier went too far, or was this the right move?
It was the right move, but I'm with Scott on this one. It should have been done at least 10 days ago, but, you know, better late than never. We were embarrassed by what was happening in Ottawa. It made it around the world. It was on every newscast everywhere in the world, but it was absolutely humiliating to get lectured by Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who was just saying, please remove those people from the bridge. That's affecting our economy. What are you doing? The Americans, say what you want about them, but they're very good on law enforcement. If there's a law in the books, they'll apply it. They don't pretend to be deciding in the place of governments. But what was interesting to hear is the stereo that was coming in from Justin Trudeau and Premier Ford over the past 24 hours. They both have the same argument. You know, governments don't give directives to the police. That is bunk. That's not true. Of course, the justice minister doesn't pick up the phone and tell the chief of police, I'll go arrest this person, they've been bugging me. That would be wrong. But in a state based on the rule of law, the government is there to do one thing first and foremost, protect the public. And when the law of the land is not being enforced, there's a huge problem because it's only inviting more problems later down the road. So what we should have had from the beginning is strong action in Ottawa. We never got it. But finally, and I think the first strong action is going to take place at the Ambassador Bridge because of the humiliation we're going through. And once they get that cleared, maybe the message will start going through in Ottawa. But they do seem to be justifiably concerned right now about the state of play there. They're worried about extreme violence. There are any number of children on those trucks right now, and they've got to be very careful of that. I can safely predict that once it does start in Ottawa, we will have viral videos going around of people screaming and kids being hauled out in dangerous situations. But this is something that they've brought upon themselves. Let's hope that everything goes well and that cooler heads prevail. But at some point, you've got to get your nation's capital back. And Mr. Trudeau has really failed in this one.
So, Jamie, over to you. Scott noted about the cautious approach that may have been, and it seems what the Prime Minister was going for because of concerns of violence. The Prime Minister said today he's concerned about violence, but is this, on behalf of the Prime Minister and Premier, weak leadership or a cautious approach?
Yeah, I think this is kind of the tragedy of the way you see jurisdictions across Canada constantly point at others and hope someone else is going to deal with it. I think when you look at how the Ottawa police prepared, it frankly appears like they weren't prepared. When you compare what took place here in Toronto last weekend and how quickly they moved along and the Toronto Police Services did their job, they didn't do that in Ottawa. And then Ottawa police started blaming others, and then you got the usual finger pointing. And I think so much of what comes out of this government, I think when you look at the Prime Minister himself right here, is like indecision's actually one of his Achilles heels. He's not quick to make a decision. And when the going gets tough, he hopes it just goes away and doesn't have to decide. And I think it really wasn't until we saw what took place in Windsor at the beginning of this week, and they actually started to shut down traffic on the Ambassador Bridge, literally the economic lifeblood artery for Ontario, that the Americans started to get on the phone, and Ottawa really realized they had a problem. Up until that, I thought you saw governments kind of saying things but not really actually doing anything to take the issue seriously. And it took phone calls, whether it was from the White House, Governor Whitmer, and others, to finally wake people up. And which is why I think you saw the Premier start to take some preliminary actions in terms of undercutting the funding that's going to these convoy organizers, as well as now the emergency order to ultimately give police the power. And I think even if you look in the Ottawa sense, it was a public servant who went to and got a civil order of injunction to get them to stop honking their horns while politicians continue to say, we don't know what to do, please help us. And it's really not a good look for Canada at large.
Okay, we want to play a quick clip here for the three of you and get your reaction to this.
I was at the cottage. I went out on my snowmobile. I take calls till 1 o'clock in the morning. I get calls before 6 o'clock in the morning, and I will not stop until we get this taken care of. And I will continue to make sure we're engaged in every single area of our responsibility.
Okay, we're going to show the photo here. So Premier Ford snowmobiling this weekend. Scott, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to start by sharing a tweet from Toronto City Councillor Josh Matlow. Of course, Premier Ford, a former Toronto City Councillor. Matlow says, Doug Ford and I often disagree, but the fact he snowmobiled on a weekend isn't evidence that he ignores his job. No one, including our leaders, should reasonably be expected to never take a moment for themselves. Ford often deserves criticism, but that criticism should be fair. Is this fair during, any other weekend, perhaps throughout the pandemic, but during what is a crisis situation in this province? The Premier, yeah, he may be taking a break, but he's also taking photos with people out having fun. I'm
going to talk out of both sides of my mouth. Yes, Josh Matlow's right.
Scott, very out of character.
It's not fair. It's not fair to say, oh, well, he's got a gotcha picture and, he needs to be on the job 24 hours a day and all that stuff. On the other hand, if I was working for the Premier, I would never, ever, ever have said, yeah, now's the right time to go to the cottage and be bombing around on your sled. It's just not a good look. We're in the midst of a crisis. So I sort of see it both ways. My bottom line is today the Premier said what he needed to say. I was glad to hear it. I welcomed it. I'm not a big supporter of the Premier's, but I literally welcomed it. But I would never, ever, ever as an advisor have said, yeah, now's the right time to go, bomb off and, make s'mores and hang around the campfire.
Okay. Mark?
Tom, I wanted to ask you on another note, with an increase in police powers announced here in Ontario, how much do you think the Premier's decision-making right now is tied into the election, which is really just a few months away from now?
100%. And it was interesting to note the change of tone from Candace Bergen 48 hours ago. All of a sudden, she had been out there applauding them on the front line. She was with the truckers, and then oops, they changed their tune completely. So that was clearly the result of some communication with Queen's Park saying, back off, we're going to have to move in on these guys. It's completely out of control. Just to give you an idea of why it's not that necessary to have the state of emergency, why the policing powers, if well directed, would have been enough. Quebec City, last Friday, same thing happened. They start assembling from all across the province of Quebec on Thursday. By Friday, they're landing in Quebec's capital, Quebec City. They were very clear. Premier Legault was clear as a bell. He was working with the Quebec City cops and with Quebec Provincial Police and said, this is not on if you're thinking of doing any damage. You're not going to be allowed anywhere near the Capitol buildings, the National Assembly itself. Welcome to your right to protest. You can protest all you want over the weekend. 5 o'clock Sunday, you're gone or you're towed. At 5:15, there was not a single rig left. That's political leadership. So Mr. Ford's now saying, I should have known. I needed this state of emergency. Now I can have orders and councils. He could have been doing all of that at the beginning of this thing. It's only when it got completely out of hand and it was affecting him. And in that regard, he's very much like Jason Kenney of Alberta. Kenney was applauding the truckers as long as they were only blocking Ottawa. He thought it was great, wonderful thing, high fives all around. They blocked his border with Montana, and trucks full of Alberta beef, a big export, were lining up and going to be lost. He said, well, you can't block my border, but it was okay to block everything happening in Ottawa. So this is where they're getting called out. And the three provinces that have the border problems, of course, are conservative provinces. They're Alberta, they're Manitoba, and they're Ontario. So they're starting to feel the pinch, but they're the ones who lit the fire, and now they're feeling the heat.
Yeah, so I want to touch on those things. Tom, of course, the opposition leaders, NDP leader Andrew Horwath, Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca. One went to Ottawa, one went to Windsor. Of course, we have an election in a few months. In terms of optics, though, to Jamie Ellerton, our Conservative strategist, Candace Bergen tweeting yesterday, thank you to the Prime Minister for the briefing this evening. I continue to call on him to take action to bring this to an end peacefully and quickly. We saw former Conservative leader Andrew Scheer giving the truckers a thumbs up. I mean, can this party be consistent with their message? What would you say? Like, is this all a bad look if they're not on the same page?
Christina, I think the short answer is no. I think there's actually a multitude of opinions and viewpoints as to what Conservatives should be doing on this. And I think the idea of this protest and how it started as something against mandates and for freedom more broadly is very different than what has actually become an entrenched siege in Ottawa. And I think when you look at some of the federal, provincial, municipal dynamics of this, there's a long history, quite frankly, of Ottawa kind of being treated separately as this federal government place and kind of forgotten as the second largest city in the province of Ontario. And so I think when you hear things are going to be happening in Ottawa, obviously the Ottawa Police and the RCMP through the NCC and other institutions coordinate all the time for state visits and the like. The OPP, frankly, don't really do much of there. So I'm really not surprised that people at Queen's Park weren't as attuned as to what was going on in terms of what the need was, which I think is part of that, again, cross-jurisdictional finger pointing. But I think when you look at what Doug Ford did today, there's clearly a sense, again, increasingly amongst the people of Ontario who are just fed up and hearing about this and want the rule of law applied. They want this to stop. They realize what the cost is going to be, especially now for all like the optics and the circus you're seeing in Ottawa. The real economic impact is what's happening in Windsor, and that just can't go on. And so I think that's why you finally saw the Premier kind of take decisive-ish action this week to ultimately empower police to do their jobs this week with new tools.
Scott, at the federal level, with Prime Minister Trudeau warning that everything is on the table, what do you expect to happen next, and what sort of timeline could we expect to see?
So I think this is the rubber of this whole issue. I think we're going to see confrontation in the next 2 days. I mean, ultimately, isn't that what it comes down to? These guys have been in camp for 14, 15 days. They've taken over critical infrastructure like the bridge. People are not willing to put up with it anymore. There's a lot of public opinion behind taking action. We've now seen political voices being declarative. They're going to take action. Police forces are clearly indicating that they're marshaling their resources. We're going to see a confrontation. I think it's going to get a little bit ugly.
Yeah. Sounds like it.
We're going to end up in a situation where people are going to be told either move or be moved, and when they don't move, they're going to be forced to move. So I think we're going to see some ugly stuff in the next 2-3 days.
Tom, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you the same question. What do you expect to happen next?
This weekend, they'll clear the Ambassador Bridge. They have no choice, and failure is not an option, to use that phrase. I remember when we had the Oka crisis here, and they did actually have to use the army. And General de Chastelain went in. He explained to the media, I've spoken with them, told them that there is no option. We will not fail. And the barricades that have been up for months finally came down. It's the same thing here. The message has to be incredibly clear that there's no possibility that they're going to be allowed to win. And once that message gets through, the hardest hard heads and the hottest hot heads will stay there and have a fight. And yes, they're worried about everything from weapons to the behavior. But at some point, the message is going to get through to the majority of them. And once they see the message at the Ambassador Bridge, I believe it'll carry over to Ottawa, and people will start to say, okay, this has gone too far. We're going to start dismantling.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're all right. It's going to be, it could be a very unfortunate 48 hours based on some of the comments we've heard from some of the protesters that they're willing to die for this cause. Okay, Tom Mulcair, Scott Reid, Jamie Ellerton, thank you so much for providing us with your analysis tonight. Thank you.
you.
As well.
Have a good
Stay safe,
weekend.
everyone.